Hello, and welcome to Grief Seeds, a podcast where you'll find insights, reframings, metaphors, and visualizations, all known as grief seeds, to help you cultivate growth and healing in your life after loss. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I'm an intuitive grief guide and author, and on this show, I'll share insights from my interactions with clients, wise words from fellow grievers, and personal stories from my own life, with the hope that they transform your grief as they have transformed mine. Because even when it doesn't feel like it, we are planting the seeds of growth in the midst of great pain and heartache. Your grief is welcome here. Hi there, grief growers, and welcome to today's episode of Grief Seeds, which is called Grief 8 Years Later. This was a topic that was requested by a Patreon supporter named Cheryl, who submitted a comment that said it would be nice to hear how grief changed for you year to year and what struggles still remain for you 8 years in. I honored the eighth death anniversary of my mom, who died in December of 2013, just this past December. It's about almost 3 months ago now. Cheryl says it's been 1 year and 9 months since my loss, and knowing what to expect from others who are further down the road is always helpful. So I think here at the beginning, the top of this broadcast, I'd love to know how far you are in your grief. Time doesn't heal all, and we can definitely get into that during this broadcast. But I'm curious to know how time has changed your grief, or how you perceive yourself as a grieving person, or how you look at your grief as an experience that shows up in your life. Because while time doesn't heal all, it certainly changes a lot of things about grief and loss. So, first off, Cheryl, thank you for this question. How grief changes from year to year. And I don't know that I necessarily have something uh, strictly and beautifully and sense makingly chronological for you. But I can lay out, I suppose, my vision of how my grief has gone over the past 8 years or so. Um, the first probably 6 months after my mom died, from the day of her death until I walked across the graduation stage as a senior in college, I was in shock. That is an entire swath, as much as I hate that word, how it feels in my mouth. That is an entire range of dates in my grief that I largely do not remember. There are glimpses of time that are very clear to me. There are events and things I remember, but there are large chunks and spaces and pockets of time that are black. They're just missing from my timeline of reality. I think this was the point in time where my brain did what protective brains do, what normal brains do when they're grieving, and saying, "This was so sudden, this was so unexpected, this is so against any reality that I could have possibly imagined for myself, that we're just gonna let in as little information as humanly possible. We're gonna only give you as much as you can take." And full disclosure, my parents' wish for me after my mom died was that I finish college. I was in my last semester of school. So I went back, and so I had to do a thesis. I was doing 15 hours of class. I was working 3 jobs. And the level of energy and stamina and logistics that I had to keep up with in order to survive being in that sort of environment after a loss was what my brain was focusing on. And all I did after that was sleep. A lot of sleep. And there's a lot in that period of my life that I don't remember. And I did an episode about this on Coming Back with Megan Devine a few years ago, about our brain's protective mechanisms when we grieve, how we go into shock mode, or there are entire periods of our loss we don't remember. I think it's really easy to beat ourselves up about not remembering chunks of time after a loss, as if we should be painstakingly keeping records or details of everything that's happening to us all the time. Um, but when you think about it in times of your life that you're not grieving, you're like, I don't remember what happened in October of my second grade year. I don't remember that. But somehow the stakes are so high with loss that we put this intense pressure on ourselves to remember what happened. So if that's a pressure you're putting yourself under right now, no matter how long it's been since your loss, I invite you in this moment to ease up on that. I think after that first 6 months or so, that's when I got sick. And this is something that I've anecdotally heard, and have been, um, kind of acquainted with through working with one-on-one clients and even in group coaching environments to recognize in grieving people is there comes a time when we can't um, burn the candle at both ends after loss. We can't try to fit ourselves back in the life that we knew before and go at that pace and at that speed and with that intention and with that energy in the same way that we did before loss. At some point, we have to acknowledge that loss is part of the mix. For me, it happened in about 6 months. For a lot of people, they can go 4 or 5 years after a loss before they really hit the wall of holy crap, I am grieving a life after loss and I'm sick from this, whether you're physically sick, energetically sick, spiritually sick, something, some breakdown happens. If I can't go at this breakneck pace and also have grief in tow, something's got to give. And for me, it expressed in being ill. I was diagnosed with adrenal fatigue and burnout, which essentially means I was stressed for so long that my body had no more stress hormones. And so I developed a lot of food allergies. I needed to sleep a lot. There were a lot of things that happened that made it so that I was forced to slow down. I was forced to change my life. I was forced to look at what I was consuming, both food wise, but also media wise, friendship wise, energy wise, word wise, belief wise, and ask, is this really serving me in my grief? And that continues to be a thread through my life to this day. I am not ill in the same ways that I was then, but there are pieces of my body that will permanently remember the the stoppedness or the abrupt halt that happened in that period of my life. It's something that I'm continuing to grieve happened because it continues to affect me. Um, and then something that I continue to just carry with me as I go forward. I think after that is when I really started taking grief into a public space. Throughout this whole time, with the exception of about the first maybe year or so after my mom's death, I wanted nothing to do with any grief resources. People would drop off books at the house or recommend podcasts or websites or support groups, and I was just so angry that my mom had died at all that I was like, I don't want anything to do with this because I couldn't have put these words to it at the time, but to acknowledge it would have been to say it's real and I have to be a part of it and I have to learn how to heal from it. And to be honest with you, I wasn't done being angry yet. I was 21 and we didn't die. I say we didn't die collectively. She didn't die. Who I was at the time didn't die on good terms. My mom and I were in the middle of a fight when she died. And so there was a lot that I was angry about. And I kind of just wanted to sit in and with that for as long as I did. I needed to be allowed to come to exploring grief on my own terms. But when I did, I went to my local library. A lot of you know this story. I got my first library card here in Chicago and checked out book after book after book on grief and loss. I found that that was the only thing I wanted to learn about because at that point, after the shock and the numbness wore off and the blackout of pieces of my life, and after I was diagnosed with various illnesses, I was like, okay, I'm recognizing there comes a point, there's like a tilting point in life after loss when you recognize I must live the rest of my life with grief in tow. I must do this with grief along for the ride. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go, but I started recognizing that other people did it and are doing it. And so I started leaning on their wisdom for help. So I started reading books, I started listening to podcasts. And this is kind of how the evolution of the work I do now happened because I started sharing what I learned on my private social media. Enough people said, I'd love to learn with this. Can you make it public? Um, I love what you do publicly. Can you start talking about it? Can you produce a podcast? I love the podcast. Can you write a book? I love the book. Can you write another? And so it's kind of just like snowballed into this larger um, experience that continues to permeate my life. And I see it sometimes. I don't know if this visual is going to be helpful for you, but I see grief sometimes as this like very individual damning experience, especially in the initial days, weeks, months, years. This has happened to me. It has affected my life. This is life as I know it now. I must grieve everything I knew before and everything I'm going to be in the future. And then over time, time does not heal all, but what it does give you is context. It gives you more experiences. It gives you more opportunities to create rituals, to see signs and symbols, to connect with other grievers, to find more information. And so gradually it's like my vision expanded from this is my loss and my experience and something that happened to me, which it is. There's no reversal or denial of that truth, but it expanded to And this has happened to other people around me, and this has been happening to everyone since the beginning of time. And there are others who have mother lost, and there are others who have grieved, even if their losses weren't mother loss. And so the vision of what grief is, what it means, who I am as a griever, that's the thing that perspective changed. The vision that I had didn't necessarily change or shift, but it expanded. Sometimes I refer to it as, if you've ever seen horses, and I don't support this practice, but horses that are in major cities and made to give carriage rides around major cities have these blinders on so that they're not spooked by cars and other traffic. And it's as if that when my mom died, I had these blinkers on the side of my eyes, and I could only see how this was affecting me in my life because that's what I had to take care of at the time. And I think this is very normal in life after loss, is to only see what you need to take care of in order to survive. This is a protective brain, heart, body, soul mechanism at the very beginning of life after loss. And then gradually, as you learn to recognize that you will survive this, this is not going to kill you. It's going to make you different, but you will not die from it. It's almost as if I had to live enough days. I don't know what the number is, there's no magic number. I had to live enough days, or I had to live enough time after the death of my mother to recognize that, okay, this is not going to kill me. So if it's not going to kill me, how do I continue surviving in the aftermath of this? And that's when I started leaning on the wisdom of others and kind of joining this. I don't know if this resonates with any of you, but this like giant club of everyone who has ever grieved. And so it continues to remain the loss of my mother, which is a very intimate individual. I had a personal relationship with her, but then also there's a simultaneous, grief is about paradox and duality, a simultaneous membership in the grief club, everyone who has ever grieved before. And so joining that group of wisdom, and those of us who remember, it's a very lovely and hard, but also very human club to be a part of. And so I think that's over the course of 8 years, from the first 6 months, a year to, and then expansion of grief into how I live it now. It's this recognizing that this is something that happened to me and with me and around me, to this is something that happens everywhere all the time, to people I know, people I don't know, people who are dead, people who are alive. Um, this expansion of perspective on grief. And none of that diminishes the importance in the individual relationship I had to my mom. It just makes it deeper and richer and offers more context for it. I am surrounded by more tools and stories and wisdom and community than I thought at the beginning. And that's what has changed. One of many things that has changed since my mom died in 2013. I think, Cheryl, to your specific question of what struggles still remain for you 8 years in, the biggest struggle that remains for me that I can put my finger on right now is that no matter what is happening in my life, the record player of "And My Mom Is Dead" never stops. That never ends, and it will never end because it's a thing that will always be true. There's a record player, a cassette player, pick whatever decade you wanna be a part of, but there's a song that plays on repeat over and over again in my head on bad days when the worst crap is happening and I don't wanna be a part of the world anymore, and my mom is dead, but on the greatest days as well. I just published a book, I had a great call with a client, I just got engaged, and my mom is dead. So there's this addition, there's this contraction, and then another half of the sentence that will never not be added to every statement that is true about my life. Because one of the most true things about me in my life right now and for the rest of my life is, and my mom is dead. It is the death of my mother has gone from this thing that is around me and happened to me to a foundation on which I literally base my life. It is one of the truths on top of which I live, in the sense that I I'm not necessarily saying I live from this place of wounded trauma. My mom is dead, so that informs everything I do. But my mom is dead, and that informs everything I do. If my mom is dead, I know that people die. I've experienced a sense of homelessness, uh, energetically, spiritually before. I have lost the person I thought I was going to be. I've lost friendships and relationships that are still alive in the world, but couldn't handle the weight of my mother's death. If I know all of that to be true, if I have experienced all of that life, then how will I live my life from here on out? So letting grief and letting her death be that informant, that great informer that sits under the bedrock of everything I do. There's a great sense of I talked to a client about this literally yesterday, of uncertainty and foundationlessness in life after loss, of especially with mother loss, the person I perceived as home on earth died. The ground underneath my feet, the person from which I came and the ground underneath my feet, heaven as above, so below kind of energy, that person died. And so to take loss as this thing that happened outside of me or to me, and um, I am at the mercy of this relentless, awful experience, and instead say, this is a truth on now I must build the core of my life. This is something I cannot change that will now inform everything I do. It shifts it from this place of grief as something that is happening to me and torturing me and endlessly will not leave me alone, to something on which this is a true fact, and what I choose to do with it and how I choose to live after it becomes something that is up to me. Yeah. So that struggle of the record player and my mom is dead, never going away, that's something that I think will exist for the rest of my life. And I'm not necessarily okay with that, but I have made a certain level of peace with it. I I teach an online course that I'm in the process of reviving soon, so stay tuned for that, called Life After Loss Academy. And in the latter sections of the course, I talk about cultivating a lifetime partnership with grief. You can perceive it as a friendship with grief, a marriage to grief, a roommate relationship with grief, however you'd like to situate grief as a presence in your life. But I think immediately after my mother's death, the record of my mom is dead, my mom is dead, my mom is dead, my mom is dead, I had this visual of, like, me sitting in the living room, grief rolling in a record player, putting that on play, and just not being able to escape it. And now that I have lived 8 years after her death, I have been able to expand the mental, spiritual, energetic, emotional house in which I live. I can go to another floor. I can play a song of my own. I can put a piano in here and start composing alongside grief. My mom is dead, and my world is full of richness. I have friendships that sustain me. What other things are true alongside this? It's not just my mom is dead, my mom is dead, my mom is dead, my mom is dead is the only thing that's shouting in this room. And so it takes me from this place of being at the mercy of grief and being relentlessly beaten or accosted by it. These are all violent words that we can associate with grief. To, yes, grief, you can speak your truth and you can have that record be playing at all times in my house. And at the same time, I have the power and ability as the homeowner of this mental, spiritual, emotional house, whatever you'd like to call it, to add another floor, to put you in the basement, to kick you out in the backyard for a while, or to add a piano, to add a kazoo, to add a tambourine. What other instruments, what other bird song, a waterfall, letting the sink run for hours and hours. What other things can we do to contribute so that grief is not a soloist, but a chorus in the grand song of our life, because it is. At first, grief is the solo. It is the loudest voice in the room. It is the one you can't escape, and it's not a voice that you love to hear all the time. I'll definitely be honest with that one. And now grief has joined so many other things that are true for me. In my life, it has joined so many other um, singers. I'm bouncing around a lot of the metaphors today, so I hope y'all are bearing with me. That are true for me in life. Yes. Oh, Cheryl, I love that you're on the call. I see Cheryl popping up in the chat that says that's a lovely metaphor of building a larger house and more rooms. I think some part of grief, and this is becoming truer and truer for me over time, and this may be true for you too, Cheryl. 1 year, 9 months in, honoring your time. 8 months and 8 years and 2 months in on my timeline, is that the process of building out the house, metaphorically, is something that has been a part of my work for these last 8 years. So it's not like we experience a loss and then, okay, now I'm going to build a bigger house to contain it. We have to sit with grief and listen to what it needs and wants from us, and process it for ourselves, and then build these rooms, build these intentional spaces, build these friendships, workplaces, partnerships, spiritual practices, rituals, memorials, signs, symbols, structures of meaning that actually resonate so that we and grief can live harmoniously in this house. You can't just experience a loss and then start building rooms willy-nilly. I think that could be a form of avoidance or hiding from grief or running away from grief. I have a very dear friend who's also on the call this morning. Her name is Kim, and she talks about how people either run from grief or they hide from grief. So they either um, run, they pick up steam, they get very busy, or they hide and kind of avoid and distract. And I think to build the house right away would be to make a project of either I'm going to do this so well and so fast. I've heard of people call themselves workshopaholics. I'm going to workshopaholic myself into learning so much about grief that I'm just going to build the house and I don't have to deal with it anymore. And then there's another kind of I'm going to build a room that's separate from grief, pull the covers over my head, and I know the song's playing in the other room, but I'm not going to listen to it. I'm not going to participate with it. I'm not going to um, make myself a part of it. And I think the house building, if you are doing it with integrity, I won't say if you're doing it right, because I'm not going to put this into the binary of right and wrong, but if you want to be in a lifetime relationship with grief, which you are by sheer nature of it existing, by sheer nature of being human, that the house building, the expanding of the space within your heart to accommodate both you and grief together, so it's not the fight of one of you trying to oust one another, must be a thing that's done well and intentionally and over the course of time. There's this lovely comic illustration by a person who goes by Jar of Salt, and it's a bookshelf and it says Grief Day 1 over the top. And there's this giant dictionary sized book that just says grief. It's a big black book and it's like clonk in the middle shelf. No other books around it. The bookshelf's completely empty. Grief is the sole focus. And then the next panel says Grief Day 658. This is an arbitrary number. I don't remember what it is. You can look it up at Jar of Salt. But it's a bookshelf, and that honkin' grief book is still in the middle, but it's surrounded by all of these other books that now give context, give layers, give meaning, give intention to grief. And they can be related to grief. So you could talk about grief and boundaries. You could talk about grief and rituals. You could talk about grief and mourning, grief and music, grief and art, grief and community, grief and expression. But there are also things that are unrelated to grief that can inform grief across time. So it could be grief and crocheting. It could be grief and taking vacations. It could be grief and new milestones that have happened in your family, getting engaged, getting married, graduating, the arrival of children, or even additional losses that can continue to inform grief. Um, as time goes on, time itself does not heal. It is what you do with and in the time that affects how you perceive your grief and what it looks like when you build out that metaphorical house. So, a few years ago, I presented on something called the bereavement cruise, and it's literally exactly what it sounds like. You go on a cruise for 7 days. It's 7 days of workshops, all related to grief and loss, but interwoven with literally a cruise experience. You're going to different ports of call. You do, a lot of the shows and the activities and entertainment and restaurants and things on board. And so interweaving a vacation, being off the grid, taking a break from regular life with the experience of diving deeply into grief, talk about new context for life after loss. What does grief look like on a cruise ship? That's something that time can help you learn. Um, it ended up being a very deep and enlivening experience for, so many people that were there. Vicky says on Instagram, "I'm crocheting right now as I listen to your soothing voice." I love it. So the incorporation of crocheting and grief. So maybe Vicky, on your metaphorical bookshelf or in your metaphorical house, you have a room where grief's playing that record of my person's dead, my person's dead, or if you have multiple losses, my people are dead, my people are dead. Maybe you have like 10 record players going at once, which can be very cacophonous. We'll pull out a big word today. But then you also say, I'm going to sit in this room with all these record players and I'm going to listen and I'm going to crochet. I'm going to put this energy into something that feels like another truth of my people are dead, my people are dead, my people are dead is, and I can make things while doing it, and I can make art while doing it, and I can soothe myself through small actions, and I can make something soft and gentle and comforting if you're crocheting for somebody else, and I can make gifts for other people, even though these truths are also true. So the work of grieving over time is not how do I heal from or erase the truth that my people are dead, my people are dead, my people are dead, or loss is real, loss is real, loss is real. It's what else is true. And those other truths help you build the rooms of this metaphorical house. Yeah, I want to scroll back up here on Instagram. James said 2 years and 3 months on the 15th of March. I had a moment today um, while running errands. Yeah, and grief is allowed to continue to arrive. I think Cheryl, this is something you were asking about in your name in your main question when you asked it for this week of what are your struggles 8 years later. I'm still surprised by grief. I'm still I don't know that I will know everything there is to know about grief and loss, and I don't think I don't think that's the point. I think if you ever get to a place where you say, "I know everything there is to know about grief," then you are getting ready to be caught off guard by grief. Um, there's a disillusion that comes with that because grief is something that is very much alive and unique and individual, but is also, ongoing and deeply global. So, I mean, talk about grief in the last 2 years or so, how the grief of my mother has shifted as we have been sitting in a pandemic. Grief has changed there. I've had to learn grief as a new experience because I think when my mom died, I had this perception because of my privilege and so many other things that the world was kind of an okay place, that it was fair. Whether or not it actually was is a whole conversation that we can also have. Um, but I had this story that I told myself at 21 years old was the world is essentially a good, kind, and just place. If you're good, good things will happen to you. If you're bad, bad things will happen to you. And my mother died, so what does that mean about me? I lost my faith. I lost my sense of home. I lost the story of a nuclear family, a place where I felt safe in the world, the hope of reconciliation, so many other things alongside that. But that existed in a world where I did not yet know what it was like to grieve in the midst of a pandemic. And so now, grieving my mom 6 years later, about the time when the pandemic started in 2020, it's like, how am I grieving my mother alongside this, like, droning ambient grief that is always hanging in the air? That's how grief can change over time as well. And I saw myself falling. It's almost like I watched myself outside of myself, and then I was in my body as it was happening. Um, the first month or so of the pandemic felt very much like the first few months after my mother's death. There was a lot of days that I don't remember, a lot of things blurring together, a lot of this will change life as I know it. A part of me that did not know a pandemic or a world with a pandemic must die in order for a new self to start to emerge. Um, yeah, the pandemic has greatly informed how I've grieved. And one thing that I definitely wanted to come on here and share today with you, Cheryl, is that one benefit, if I can call it that, of having experienced grief like this for as long as I have, for 8 years, is that now I've lived so long beyond my mother's death that I know that I can survive more loss or more grief down the road. One of the struggles that I see so many clients have, especially as they grieve very close to when their loss has happened, is I don't know how I'm going to survive this. And my response to that is, of course, you don't know how you're going to survive this because you've never had to before. It's very similar to um, saying something like, I don't know how I'm going to learn this skill. I don't know how I'm going to learn this piano concerto. Can you tell I grew up playing piano? There's a lot of piano metaphors in here today. I don't know how I'm going to ever play a 12-page piano piece. Of course you don't, because you've never had to play piano at this level before. You've never had to play a piece this long. You've never had to play a piece in this key. You've never had to touch a piano in your life. So how are you going to do it? And this is the crummy part where I tell you that survival after loss is a lot of practice. It's a lot of continuing to live the same day or what feels like the same day, a lot of Groundhog Day and grief, over and over and over again. And you might think that that's pointless. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not improving. I'm not progressing. I'm even regressing. But the lovely thing about just the accumulation of days alone, as you can get to the end of a week, you can get to the end of a month, you can get to the end of 6 months, you can get to 1 year and 9 months, Cheryl, in your grief and look back and say, now I know I can survive loss at least up to that point, or for that long, or within that context, even if nothing else happened, even if you grew, changed, progressed in no other way. I made it through 1 year and 9 months. I made it through 8 years and 2 months. I made it through this amount of time. And it's almost as if the brain, but also the heart, has to build up this body of evidence that it's possible to survive because the story at the very beginning is I will not, I cannot, I don't know how. And that's normal. That's to be expected after a major loss. But the lovely gift of time passing after loss is that it has no choice but to pass, and we have no choice but to let it. And so, if nothing else, that can be one, again, going back to foundations and talking about the things that you sit on top of or stand on top of as foundational truths is one thing I know for sure is I have lived 1 year and 9 months after the death of my soulmate, and that's one piece of evidence that I can play as a contrasting record or complementary record to this, and my soulmate is dead, and my soulmate is gone. I want to pop into the chat and look at questions. So if you'd like to share stories with us of how long it's been since your loss or losses have occurred, how things have changed for you, things you still struggle with, I'd love to take your questions for the next 10 minutes or so if you have input here. Kim jumped on the call to say, so helpful to map the pattern of grief through what the body experiences. Many years after my losses, I too continue to grow in my capacity to believe the pain won't kill me. There's toll on my body from the numbing and avoiding that I do and keep doing in parentheticals, but there is also toll on my body when the grief and pain come up. I am very slowly learning to trust that my body can handle the pain of grieving. Experiencing this capacity growing is my long term grief story. Yes, and I think this is a beautifully, God, like butcheringly true reality of what grief is grief will beat you up. I'm not gonna sit here and be like, and I'm fluffy and all is well and I've healed from this. Grief has caused, and this is not true for everyone, physically at least, or illness wise, but grief has caused permanent damage to my body. Like the experience of grieving my mother has left me with stressors, hormonal imbalances, even last year when I experienced the seizure, like body residue, things that stick to me that cannot be unstuck. Grief literally reshapes who we are. It must. It by nature it does. And let me point out because I want to make this crystal clear, this is not because we are not strong enough to withstand it. Please let that sink in. This is not because we are not strong enough to withstand it. It is because we are so human and we are so moved and in love and touched by the people, places, things, ideas, beliefs that we have lost, that we are so connected to them that we have no choice but to receive their impact when we lose them, sometimes physically. So I love this input from Kim that there is a toll on my body when I avoid grief, and there's a toll on my body when I participate. And so part of grief is acknowledging that no matter which choice I make to avoid grief or to engage with it, for lack of better phrasing, there will be a price that I pay. There will be some way in which I am physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually forced to pay some sort of price to either engage with grief or to disengage from it, to participate or to avoid. There is no way to escape, and this is another hard foundational truth of grief. There's no way to escape pain and the hard work of looking at it, whether that be physical, spiritual, mental, emotional. Grief asks, grief shows up and asks that we wear this new set of glasses that is permanently superglued to our face that says, I need you to see and acknowledge the pain in the room. I won't tell you what to do with it. Grief won't necessarily tell you what to do with your pain. But it says, I need you to know that this exists because it matters. It matters because we're connected to each other. It matters because other people are impacted by it. It matters because love is and was and continues to be real. Yeah. There is a kind of, and we can do a whole other grief seeds episode on this. There is a kind of surrender that grief forces us to assume, forces us to take on, forces us to practice In life after loss, we have no other choice but to acknowledge the pain in the room. That does not mean that we will always be in pain. It does sometimes, but it means that irreparably for the rest of your life, permanently from here on out, you will always notice the pain in the room. Whether it be your own pain, the pain of other people, especially if you're highly empathetic, um, you will always be attuned to that. Grief, mm, it almost like it retunes your ears, like there's dials in there of things that you listen for, of things that you're attuned to. It's like grief comes in and changes those dials and then puts super glue around them. They cannot be changed. Yeah, I something else that's happened 8 years later after the death of my mother's, I see grief everywhere. If you followed me long enough on social media, you've heard me, or seen me write the phrase, "Grief is political." Grief shows up in so many places. Death, loss, what we're willing to lose, the ways we're avoiding grief or pursuing grief, they literally are foundationally informing all of our lives. And because I lost my mother, I cannot unsee the truth of that. I cannot see the truth of how grief influences our societies, our cultures when we're at war or when other countries are at war, or who gets what when it comes to resources or money or neighborhoods or parks or justice. There is no way to separate that from your life anymore. And it's okay if you're in the early days of your grief, maybe it's not appropriate or maybe it's not survivable to see all of that right now. Sometimes I have to put the blinkers back on again and narrow down the scope so I can take care of myself before acknowledging the grief of the world. But the pain of that, recognizing the pain that's in everything, by beginning by acknowledging the pain in yourself with grief, is something that you can't ever unsee. Yeah. Um, Emily says on Instagram, it's been 1 year and 1 month since the loss of my dad. Honoring that for you, Emily. Around the 1 year mark, I felt this shift in my grief, this new chapter of it. Like, holy shit, I've lived a whole year of firsts, first birthday without him. His first birthday, Father's Day, holidays, and now it's setting in that yes, I got through the firsts, but only the firsts. I have so much longer to go. Yeah, and I think this is especially true. And I mean, let's write that down to do a whole other grief seeds on. Um, the pluses and minuses of the year of firsts, because there are many. The plus of the year of firsts is that you'll never have to do it again. The minus of the year of first is now you got to do the rest of it. Now you have to do it on repeat for the rest of your life. And there's a bunch of reality that slams into you after that. Um, a lot of people stop showing up after the first year. If they continued to show up throughout the first year at all, there's a whole other truth in that. But yeah, there comes this tipping point of like, I just got to get through the first, and then you run out of firsts, and you're like, now I have to do this forever. It becomes this very drastic story of I got to get through the firsts to I got to get through forever. So if it helps Emily, maybe breaking it down into I got to get through the firsts, I got to get through the seconds, I got to get through the thirds, I got to get through the fourths, and understanding too that there will be firsts that are staggered. So the firsts aren't necessarily limited to the first year, although many of them are, but there will also be firsts that extend beyond that. So maybe first move into a house or first major career change or first child or first partnership or marriage or relationship or something like that. Maybe things that are firsts that come later, especially for people who have grieved a long time. There's a lovely book called The After Grief by Hope Edelman. The first time that you are older than the age of the person when they died, that's a first that can often come way later in life. So acknowledging there may be some bizarre twisted comfort in that you haven't lived all the firsts yet, and so it doesn't have to switch so rapidly from first to forever. Um, but also, yes, there is a grief in I've survived all the firsts. Now what? And so that can be something that's painful to sit with and live with because there's the weight of the firsts, which feel hard enough, and then there's the weight of the rest of my life, which can feel much heavier and much longer because we don't know how long that is or how long it will be. It's can I take all of that stamina that I tried so hard and used so much of to live through the first year and apply it to forever? Feels like a heavy lift. That's a loud record that's playing there in the living room of your house, Emily. I wonder, um, maybe we can build out an east wing for the year of seconds and let that be true for you. Yeah, Joy says 10 months of first next Friday is the first without celebration of his birthday, but we'll honor it. Yeah, and I think this is something we'll talk about throughout Grief Seeds and in future episodes too, is that ritual and memorial and remembering, active remembering, choosing to make dates to remember things, is a lovely way to stay in touch with your grief across time, no matter how long it's been. So in the 8 years since, my mom's been gone, I've always done something on her death anniversary. Her birthday's coming up later this month. My sister and I usually do something then. Oftentimes on Mother's Day, I'll either be a part of something or do something privately to remember her. So there's these little pockets of dates, that continue to be true. It's kinda like these flags or these stakes in the ground that continue to mark the time. And these are days, Cheryl, I don't know if this is helpful for you when I let time recompress again. I let it get smaller. I let it feel like it just happened yesterday. I say I let it, sometimes it just does. So, I sound like I have control over all of this, I really don't most of the time. But on days, especially like my mom's death anniversary, grief says, "Can we remember what it was like that day? Can I compress time for you a little bit?" And I say, "Yeah, I'm willing to participate in that. I must. Play that record a little louder. I won't try and block it out. I won't add in the piano. I won't turn on the sync for hours and hours while you play it. Just play it." And I can sit in that room with grief and we can listen to it together. And then I go retreat to another room of the house to recover from that. Kim says again, I also learned that when I'm willing to allow the pain of grief to come, healing comes through it too. The pain that comes from avoiding grief most often does not come with healing. Yes. So I think we should probably do another grief seeds on this. Is inability to escape pain is what I'll write down. Um, but what comes with it. It's very red button or blue button. It's like avoid grief or, engage with grief, and there's pain both ways. It seems like there's no winning, but when in engaging with grief, often there is learning, often there's rest, often there's insight, often there is growth, often there's community. Are we saying hello to all the wonderful people who are in the chat, today? Honoring yours and each other's griefs, even though we're all here live today. This is the most active grief seeds we've had yet. So I'm excited to continue to interact with all of you here. Often there's community, often there's healing, often there's rest, often there's truth. That's ultimately what I'm striving for in my life is how do I keep saying what's true over and over again? Nothing being hidden, everything being brought up and into the light. Whether that means it gets burned away or I get to keep it and it gets shown upon for the rest of my life. Yeah, there's often something that comes with it. And grief over years and years and years, going back to your question, Cheryl, can be this struggle of do I choose to avoid or do I choose to engage? And sometimes we need to choose to avoid. Sometimes it's a survival tactic to be like, that is a grief that I'm going to need to postpone for the next 2 years, for the next 10 years. I'm gonna hit the snooze button on that one because I'm just trying to go to work. I'm just trying to walk the dog. I'm just trying to get out of bed. And so there is a benefit to putting grief off or working with grief heavily on a very deep level until a later date. I see this a lot with the pandemic. I feel as if modern loss contributed to a wonderful piece, I believe, for the Washington Post. Don't quote me on that. That speaks about how about a decade from now, 20, 30, 32, there will be, I believe, with almost no shadow of a doubt, a great communal resurgence of the griefs that we faced during the pandemic because there is, I just need to survive this thing. And then there's, and now I need to mourn everything that I lost or wasn't able to have or was taken from me during this experience. Sometimes that must come later. So, for instance, the grief of war sometimes is not grieved while the war is still happening. It's grieved years and years and years later because the work of surviving must be done first. And that's okay. So it's okay that that work is done later. There's no timeline for this. Time will can be an aid or an assist to you, but what it should never be, time, is your hostage keeper, your prison guard, your executioner, your judge, jury. Mm-mm. Time simply is, and grief happens within and around it. Yeah, getting some hearts for that one on Instagram. Oh, please release that burden of time. Yes, and Vicky is recommending in the chat, The Body Keeps the Score. That is a lovely book that I covered on Grief Book Roundup, if you haven't gone and listened to that podcast yet, about the body's relationship to trauma, which is essentially anything that happens suddenly or unexpectedly. Even if your loss was expected, it can be a kind of trauma. So it's a lovely book for reconnecting with the body specifically again after devastating loss. So I do recommend that one. And Emily says, thank you so much for that reframing. All of that helps in moving into the second year. Yeah. And Emily, I hope those who are listening either live here or on the replay on the podcast will join me in wishing you ease, whatever that looks like for you, and honoring of your dad as you enter into the second year, whatever that looks like for you and however that shows up. Yes, and Joy says, I'll be eating a lot of ice cream to celebrate his birthday. Yeah, next Friday, honoring that for you too as well, Joy. Thank you all so much for joining me today across Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. I love interacting with you and hearing your grief stories, especially these ones related to longevity, how long it's been. There are these common threads, and then there are these things that make us different as well. If it's safe for you to do so, I invite you to come into a place. If you're not driving a vehicle or if you're not walking out in a public space, I invite you to come with me, feet flat on the ground, into a space of just quiet presence. And if it feels good to you, you can close your eyes and join me for this blessing as we go off to the rest of the day. Deep breath in with me here and out. Let's do one more deep breath in here and out. May you, grief growers, as you continue to live lives after loss, may you know and remember that time is not your keeper, that there is no expectation from grief, from the loved ones you have lost, to heal or be better or be done within a certain amount of time. May grief and its mighty record player of truth, however it looks inside the home of your heart, give you all the permission you need to keep playing that song over and over and to explore what other songs, what other stories, what other methods of healing are true for you right now. May you approach your losses and your griefs and your emotions with gentleness and compassion, knowing that even when there is pain in avoiding and pain in engaging, that something divine happens when we choose to participate with grief. We know more of who we are. We see more of what helps. We acknowledge that, yes, we can survive because we've made it this long already. And we get to remember the people and the ways in which we have loved. May you know that time does not heal all, but that time has no choice but to give you the benefit of perspective and context and community and growth in whatever ways they show up for you, because time has no choice but to keep going. May you find ways that feel nourishing, comforting, grounding, peacemaking, and healing to interweave the person or people that you've lost across the timeline of your life. Because in this space here, and I hope in the home in your heart, you are never required to forget. Deep breath in here and out. Thank you all so much for joining me today on Grief Seeds. This was absolutely lovely to interact with you here. I'll tell you right now that I'll be traveling for the next 2 weeks, so you will not see me again for 2 weeks here on Saturdays. But I will be sure to send an email. If you're not already subscribed to those, you can do so at shelbyforsythia.com when I'm going live again. And you can also watch my Instagram and Facebook and YouTube pages to find out when we will all be together. Thank you so much for interacting. Thank you so much for your ideas. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you because even through grief, we are growing. I'll see you all next time. So that's all for this episode of Grief Seeds. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find additional grief support at shelbyforsythia.com or by following me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you in your life after loss, please leave a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And be sure to share Grief Seeds with a friend, because you never know what someone you love is going through. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for financially keeping this podcast on the air. If you'd like to support Grief Seeds on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge, you can do so at patreon.com/shelbyforsythia. My Patreon supporters receive behind-the-scenes access to everything I create, discounts on online courses and workshops, and priority vote on what grief topic I speak about next. Music for Grief Seeds is performed by Addie Goldstein. As always, my dear grief growers, it was beautiful sharing this space and time with you today. I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing. Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/shelbyforsythia. You can find a link in the show notes.